Thank you and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Judy Laster. I'm the director of the Woods Hole Film Festival, and this year is our 29th edition. Traditionally, our festival takes place the last Saturday of July through the first Saturday of August each summer in Woods Hole, and we have year-round screenings as well. This year, as everybody is aware, in the middle of March, when the COVID pandemic struck, it became clear that the ability to have a live and in-person event was probably going to be greatly curtailed. Within a month, we also figured out that it would be impossible to have the Woods Hole Film Festival as we traditionally present it. So we spent 2 months working pretty much day and night to pivot, which is the word of the pandemic, from a live and in-person event to a virtual film festival. This is our first virtual edition. It has been an amazing experience so far. We have incredible films, 187 films. It's been so popular that we are extending the festival through Monday evening at midnight. So there's still time to see the festival films and to participate in the festival's events. Just before we get started introducing this fabulous panel, I would just want to say that this panel will last until 2 p.m. and then the second half of the panel will come in from 2 to 3 p.m. So if you're in the audience, you do not have to do anything, you can stay, but we will be joined by a second panel at 2 o'clock. So every year during the Woods Hole Film Festival, we try as much as possible to incorporate films that are relevant to the science that happens in this community. Woods Hole is a community that is home to scientific organizations that attract science research and researchers from around the world. It is a thriving, bustling village right where you take the ferry to Martha's Vineyard, home of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the Marine Biological Laboratory, the National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Geological Survey, and much more. And so when possible, we collaborate with the science community to do several things. One is to show films that we know are going to be of interest to our audience, but also to show films that are going to present the kind of work that happens here in a way to people that might not get a chance to understand it otherwise. And so a number of years ago, we developed the Woods Hole Film Festival Film and Science Initiative. The goal of this initiative, and it is evolving over time, is to bring together filmmakers and scientists to make better films about science, to tell the science stories in a compelling, interesting, and scientifically accurate way. And this panel that we're going to be chatting with right now really represents the strength of the stories, the power of science, and the strength of people when they come together to make interesting and I think game-changing films. So with us, we have Jeff Orlowski and Larissa Rhodes, who are the director and producers of The Social Dilemma. That film, which is not in this year's Woods Hole Film Festival, will be coming out, I think, sometime later this year. We don't exactly know the date, but they have also worked on several other films that have a direct science relationship as well, those being Chasing Coral and Chasing Ice. We had Chasing Coral here a couple of years ago. It was an amazing smash hit. We also are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Anna Lemke. Dr. Lemke is featured in the film The Social Dilemma, and she is a psychiatrist and associate professor of psychiatry, behavioral sciences, anesthesiology, preoperative and pain medicine at Stanford University Medical Center. And we also are joined by Andre Fenton, who is a professor of neuroscience at NYU. And Andre studies how brains store experiences as memories and how the expression of knowledge activates information that is relevant, and I'm reading this, that is relevant without activating what is irrelevant. His lab uses molecular, electrophysiological, behavioral engineering, and theoretical methods to investigate these fundamental and interrelated issues in neuroscience. You might say, interesting combo here. What could we possibly be talking about? Well, this panel will tell us what we're talking about and why. And so Jeff and Larissa, I'm just gonna say, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. But Jeff and Larissa, talk about the social dilemma. Tell the audience who hasn't seen it a little bit about the film and why we are talking today about the connection between brain research and social media.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Judy, for the intro, and it's great to be here with everybody. The past projects that Larissa and I have worked on, Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral, as you mentioned, were explorations into climate change, visual evidence of climate change, and how can we share with the public what the science community knows about our changing landscapes. So in those projects, we really tried to dive deep into how glaciers were changing, how coral reefs were changing, and to understand those ecosystems. A couple years ago, we started on this new film, The Social Dilemma, and it started with an exploration into what is social media doing to society. And for us, it just kind of unfurled into this investigation, both in terms of how is the technology working, how do algorithms work, what is machine learning, what's happening on the other side of your screen, and trying to understand that very deeply. And then at the same time, trying to understand what are the implications on society as a whole, and how is it affecting people? How is it affecting the brain? How is it affecting the human body? And for us, from a scientific exploration perspective, it was incredibly fascinating on both of those fronts. Larissa and I knew very little / nothing about algorithms, algorithmic bias, about how these systems work. And so it was a huge education on that front. And then our role as storytellers to somewhat distill that and to be able to try to share that out with the public. And that was one of the big things that I think we came to in this process. These systems are so incredibly powerful and very poorly understood by the general public, both in terms of how they operate, what are the algorithms optimized for, how do the algorithms actually function, as well as the research that's just continuing to come out and continuing to grow around what are the actual implications to the public and to people, and especially kids. So that was how, I'll just pause there for a second. That's the quick summary of the film.
I think I would add too that what is so fun about filmmaking is we get to go on this journey of learning every time we sit down for an interview, and every time we read a research paper and try to parse out and understand, something that we didn't know. We were very unfamiliar with the landscape of how technology is altering our brains, or how our brains react to different pieces of the technology that we interact with every day. So I think that combination of trying to understand the science and then being able to use the scientists and their eloquent words to be able to share those stories in a visually compelling way. So it's a challenge for the scientists and a challenge for us as filmmakers.
So I think we're going to see probably a clip in a minute, but Jeff and Larissa, do you want to talk about, and we'll bring Anna and Andre in here too, like you feature many, many different people in this film. How did you decide sort of where the science was going to fit into the story and who to bring into the film? And maybe we'll bring in Anna after this too.
Yeah, that's a great question. And sort of going back to what we were sharing just a second ago, for us, we're working in nonfiction film, right? So there's a different category of how fiction film might bring on scientific advisors to understand and craft a script. For us, these pursuits around nonfiction filmmaking, I somewhat look at it as long-form journalism, and trying to assess, based on all of the advice and the insights that we get from experts, from interviews that we can conduct, what does the story look like? What is the shape of the story? What are the opportunities there? There are an infinite number of ways to tell any of those stories. And so for us, we were trying to, with this project, trying to wrap our heads around what exactly is going on with these systems and what are the implications to society. The clip that we'll be sharing in a little bit, it's about one of our main subjects, Tristan Harris, who was a former insider at Google, and started speaking out about his early realizations within the company. He was a design ethicist at the company, and so his mandate was thinking about the implications to society. What are the ethical implications to the software that they were building? And as he was thinking about that, he was starting to piece together all of the different research around what what kind of downstream unintended consequences is happening. And that's one of the main reasons how we first got introduced to Orlowski, and wanting to get a sense of what exactly is happening to people, what's happening in the brain. We were really trying to understand the dopamine response, really trying to understand what is this, everybody talks about tech addiction, and that was certainly a very, very big conversation a couple of years ago that has kind of been embodied into our society now, but we were really trying to understand what's going on with the software that that would lead us to that. Just as a brief aside, through our conversations with Dr. Lemke, we had envisioned so many different animations and ideas, and let's fly into the brain, and we could do this, and it was a huge exploration for us around how do we bring the science to life in different ways. So yeah, maybe I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Lemke, in terms of just your thoughts, your experience in terms of how this came about.
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very exciting for me to be a part of your storytelling. I'm very grateful to people like you who bridge this gap between art and science and get, you know, information out there in a way that is powerful and inspiring and also factually correct. So, you know, I'm excited to be a part of the project. I am, you know, a psychiatrist and an addiction medicine specialist, and my research is qualitative, based on sort of narrative interviews with patients and others over long periods of time. And also I'm a clinician, so I see people who struggle with addiction, and I'm a teacher. So I teach about addiction to medical students, to trainees. And, you know, what was very clear to me starting in the early 2000s was that more and more patients were coming in, not just with drug and alcohol addiction, but with addictions to video games, addictions to pornography, addictions to online shopping, all kinds of compulsive overconsumption related behaviors that were really mediated not just by the desktop computers, but now by this mobile device that they could take anywhere, that they could access anytime, that had these kind of features that kept them engaged even beyond when they wanted to be engaged. So, so that's been really the focus of my research and my work, which is primarily inspired by my clinical concern for patients, especially young people who are really struggling with this. And a lot of times, you know, people will ask me, well, is that really an addiction? I mean, can you really be addicted to video games? Can you really be addicted to pornography? And all I can tell you is the answer is absolutely yes. I have patients who have lost everything because of these types of addictions. I have patients who are suicidal because of these types of addictions. So again, you know, I'm very grateful to be a part of this, and you know, really excited about the work that you're doing.
So Andre, we're going to bring you into the conversation as well. So your work really focuses, and I'm probably wrong about this, and correct me if I am, on the elemental aspect. You're really trying to, through your science, understand at the very molecular level how the brain works. And sort of related to this conversation, you know, the whole idea of algorithms, I don't know what they really are, but the whole idea of using some sort of mathematical sequence to make people act a certain way or not act a certain way, or to make machines act a certain way that affects people. How does that relate back to the work that you're doing, and how does the work that you're doing sort of move forward into the application in the social media and the technology sector?
Great, well, thank you for having me. The reason I'm grateful for being part of the panel is I'm actually interested in many ways in the same questions that we're all here interested in. I just am working on it at the nuts and bolts level. So I'm interested in what happens to a mind when one is addicted. What happens to a brain, and how a brain actually experiences, you know, happiness, despair, joy, anything, frankly. The experience itself is what interests me. And I'll try and succinctly give you my point of view. This may not necessarily be everyone's point of view, but the neurobiologist in me looks at a subject, a person, or a fruit fly or a mouse, and says, I can observe behaviors. Those behaviors appear compulsive, given this example. Well, how does that happen? Because ultimately, that subject is made up of neurons, and those neurons are just cells that manipulate proteins and other ions, material things, and somehow they are organized and operating very much like a machine, a biological machine, to give you what we observe as behavior, and in particular, to give the subject the experience that they have. And so I'm super interested in understanding really exactly what the engineers at Google were interested in understanding, but how it operates at the nuts and bolts level. And what I found really interesting about the film in particular is, very often people ask me, so what is social media and what's tech doing to our brains? And this is actually a pretty hard question to answer, because they'd like me to tell them about the molecule that has changed or overexpressed, or which genes are changed in their expression. And what I liked about the film is it didn't really ask that question. It asked, how is this technology actually changing the way people behave, not worrying about the neurobiology so much. And what you focus on in the algorithms is actually a level of research that we study. The brain is executing its own algorithms. It frankly doesn't know, I think, the ultimate difference between a piece of technology and a chocolate cake. These are just neural activity once you get past the senses in the brain, and they have just as much power, if you will, and just as much neural occupancy of how the brain is working to either do something positive or do something destructive. Addiction is not usually considered a positive thing, so I try and be a neutral in my assessments of behavior, but at the same time, it can also be very motivating. And so how these mechanisms interplay is really what's fascinating. And when you pick something intended for good and harness it and hijack it and turn it into something devastating, this is a natural mistake to make when we don't really fully understand the nuts and bolts mechanism.
Yeah. That's I'd love to follow up on that, Andre, because what you're describing there is something that I think we really resonated with when talking with our subjects. There's a strong analogy that some of our subjects have used to magic, and this notion of magic. It's like you don't need to understand what's happening in the brain; you just know it works. You know that the magic trick can fool somebody, and I don't need to fully understand how that illusion was operating in the brain. And that seems to be how a lot of the software was also designed. It's just trying to optimize for whatever works and not needing to necessarily understand the full path that got there.
I'm also super jealous of both of your students, as even your brief introductions, I just wish I could sit in your class all day. But I'm glad that you do understand those things and are able to articulate them in a way that allows the people that may not be scientists like yourselves to enter into that pathway. And I think that the storytelling and the way that you're able to give an analogy, analogies are something that we've really used in our filmmaking to try to help people understand what are we actually talking about. And I think some of the work that you've done, Andre, as well, in terms of using, mice or things like that to be able to replicate or talk about the behaviors that we have and show them in a way that we can understand.
Something I tell everyone in my laboratory is when I was a younger scientist, I used to be impressed by complicated things and feel proud of myself if I could express something that no one else could understand except the one expert in the room. And with time, I realized I really didn't understand anything. And when we actually understand things well, we can be extraordinarily clear about this. And that's actually the goal, right? When we write our scientific papers, they may seem impenetrable, and they often are, because we don't know enough to make them clearer to the general public. Think about DNA. Almost everybody understands DNA in its essence. Nobody really needs to understand what the base pairs are and how the hydrogen bonds form, and that they can be non-canonical and all of that. No one really needs to understand that. What we need to understand is there's a molecular basis for storing the information that can build life forms, right? And that is a mind-blowing concept. That's the hard thing. But we now understand it. My kid, who's 6, started to understand that when she was 6. She's 11 now. And that's because we figured out how to talk about it and really understand it. And then we could communicate it. So, that's in part what filmmaking and what I think art is capable of doing, taking these fancy concepts, forcing us to articulate them so that we, pretend we really know what we're talking about, and take a stance on it, not on the minutia, but on the fundamental important pieces, and then help us communicate that in the way people understand best, which is, through story.
So this might be a good time to sort of ask you guys to bring in the clip, but Jeff, you initially said this is a non-fiction film, which it is a documentary. However, there is a fictional timeline that you bring in, because why? Did you feel like, go ahead.
It's a great question. This was not planned in our original conception of the film, but it's something that as the filmmaking evolved, we had this both opportunity and need to try to illustrate some of the concepts. So as we started learning more and more about how the algorithms actually work, I kept thinking, like, what's on the other side of the screen? Like, how are those algorithms operating? What are they doing to us? And when you think about your Google search results, or your Facebook feed, or your Twitter feed, or any feed that you see on the internet, that list is being generated on the fly specifically and customized for you as an individual. It is designed with every particular post in the order that it's shared is being customized for you. And that is what the algorithm is doing. That's what the AI is doing. And learning over and over how to give you more engaging content, or more things that you're interested in, or things that you might comment on. And there are all these different various factors there. As we started discovering that, we kept referencing, Larissa and I and our team kept referencing the Pixar film Inside Out, where they fly into the little girl's brain and they show the control panels. And I'm curious what Anna and Andre have to think about that film, because it's like, I've loved hearing the care and accuracy with which the Pixar storytelling team approached the different emotions and the function of the human brain in that film. So what we ended up doing for The Social Dilemma, and I don't want this to be a huge spoiler for everybody, but we tried to bring that same concept to life with our technology, and to fly into the phone, and we basically anthropomorphized the algorithms on the other side of your screen, and portrayed the relationship between one human and his algorithms hiding in the computer, which was just both a really, really fun and entertaining way. And I think it gave us a space to visualize the concepts and help the public feel a little differently about their phone. I think our hope was, like, when you finish watching the movie and you look at your phone, maybe you're remembering those characters on the other side of your screen, and you're like, oh, I wonder why I'm seeing this thing right now, or why am I getting this notification right now, or so that was the intent.
And Larissa, did you want to jump
Well,
in?
No, I was just going to add, because it will tee up the clip that we're going to show. And I do wish we had one of Dr. Lemke, but you'll have to watch the movie when it comes out to see her fabulous presentations in it. But I think also, in addition to what Jeff was saying about using narrative elements to help give imagery and allow us an entrance into the story, we also just use the perspectives of some of these tech insiders, the people that helped build some of the technology. And from their perspective, how did they start to recognize and realize what they were building and the implications that it had? So this can be a good moment maybe to just tee up this clip here. Excellent. Can you all see and hear?
I was on the Gmail team and I just started getting burnt out because we'd had so many conversations about, what the inbox should look like and, what color it should be. And I, felt personally addicted to email. And I found it fascinating. There was no one at Gmail working on making it less addictive. And I was like, is anybody else thinking about this? I haven't heard anybody talk about this. I really struggled to try and figure out how from the inside we could change it. And that was when I decided to make a presentation, kind of a call to arms. Every day I went home and I worked on it for a couple hours every single night. It basically just said, never before in history have 50 designers, 20 to 35-year-old white guys in California, made decisions that would have an impact on 2 billion people. 2 billion people will have thoughts that they didn't intend to have because a designer at Google said this is how notifications work on that screen that you wake up to in the morning. And we have a moral responsibility as Google for solving this problem.
So I am confident when this film is widely seen, there is going to be a huge discussion. How did we end up here, with this fractured and challenging thing? Because I cannot imagine that when social media first started, when all these things were developed, that this was the actual intention of the people who were developing it. And yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Having spent so much time in the climate change world, I actually do make, and this might seem a little extreme or drastic, but I make a comparison around social media to fossil fuels, in that at the birth and origin of fossil fuels, they just seemed great and amazing, and the opportunity was plentiful, and we could transform the way we lived our lives, and it was nothing but rose-colored glasses, until we later recognized the consequences that it has to our entire ecosystem. And taking one particular action, moving carbon from the ground to the atmosphere, and the downstream consequences of that to the planet are clear now in retrospect. Along those same lines, I think that social media had very, very good and positive intentions at the start. It then fell into a business model due to a whole variety of reasons that was based on selling our attention. And for better or worse, right now, Google, Twitter, Facebook are stuck in a business model where they make more money based on the amount of time and advertisements that we see on their platforms. So the incentives aren't aligned for the general public. The incentives are aligned for manipulation. And that's what some of the subjects in our films say, that the product of Facebook and Google is not the information or the access. The product that they are actually selling to the people giving them money is the ability at scale to shift the way the world thinks. And that's through an advertising campaign, or that's through a political campaign, or that's through what have you. But the product that they're selling is the access to the largest network of people in the world, and the ability to micro-target and individually influence that individual person or that type of person that they're looking to influence. When you look at it from that perspective, if that's the product that they are selling, and the search results or the community, the network effects or the images that you're looking for, those are just the things that keep bringing us back to the system, right? That's the candy that keeps us in. But that there is this kind of secret machine running behind the scenes that is how they make their trillions and trillions of dollars. That's been a very, very new perspective to me. Like, that's where when you have this business model in place, and addiction being just a part of that whole system. Like, the addiction element is what allows the flywheel to keep spinning. That's where we're seeing the consequences to political polarization, to radicalization, to misinformation, to conspiracy theories going viral, to election manipulation. We basically have just built tools now that enable election manipulation. manipulation. Lines in the film is that in the 2016 election, Russia didn't hack Facebook, they just used Facebook the way it was intended and designed for, just with a different intention in mind. So that's my, my view on some of these platforms right now. They're not designed for the general public's, we're not the only focus in which they're thinking. They are thinking about how do advertisers benefit the most from these platforms, and that's what leads us down this slippery slope.
So Dr. Lumpke and Andre, I mean, so as scientists, I mean, you both work in fields that are incremental, right? As far as understanding and being able to be determinative about a particular issue. Participating in a film requires, I would imagine, a little bit, thinking about things a little bit differently, because films are telling a story that has a beginning, middle, and an end. How do you, when you're participating in films, sort of focus on the storytelling aspect while also trying to present the science accurately?
Well, I can speak for myself on that. You know, what I try to do in terms of my role helping Larissa and Jeff is very similar to what I do when I teach students, Stanford undergraduates and medical students. And so I try to sort of mimic that a little bit. And when I teach, what I really try to remember is my own learning process. Before I understood this concept, what was my process in coming to understand it? And then once I did understand it, in particular, I rely on a lot of visual images and metaphors in my teaching. So then, well, what is a simple concept that can convey the core piece of what I want my students to understand, which will inevitably be an oversimplification, but as Andre really wonderfully described, that when we really understand something, at least at its very core level, we can use metaphors and we can use simpler narratives to convey the core concept. And I think that's true with the science of addiction. So, you know, 50, 100 years ago, I mean, it was a very new science. Now, we have some of the best animal models in terms of addiction, far better than any animal models that we have for any other mental health disorder. And so the science is really robust, and we are at a place in terms of understanding the reward pathways in these motivational systems and what happens when you tweak these motivational systems again and again and again, and how it changes the set point in terms of your, you know, your own kind of emotional well-being. So that's what I think about. Jeff, though, it was fascinating for me to hear you sort of talk about what you had learned in your process and how kind of what you distilled from it. And I thought that was really a beautiful kind of, you know, explanation, and also your own awakening. What was fascinating, though, was a little bit to me what you left out of that, which is almost the part that I focus on the most in terms of the whole impact of this phenomenon, which is not just the way that we're being manipulated and that these messages, you know, create the narrative that we then subscribe to in our echo chamber, et cetera, but very much in terms of our own emotional well-being, what these devices are doing to us in terms of our quality of life and how we feel on any given day, and how this constant engagement ultimately makes us unhappier. You know, and that's what I think, that's what I'm waiting for people to understand. And I'm optimistic that your film will bring us forward in that, because these devices are so engaging that it really will take a kind of awakening on the part of, you know, the general populace to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, like this thing is something that maybe I should put away for a while. And I should do it, you know, there are all kinds of reasons, politically, socially, altruistically, but ultimately I should put it away because it makes me feel like crap.
Yeah.
And so how to explain the science behind that?
That's great. And I think when we started working on this project a couple of years ago, I was very heavily addicted, and I would use the word addicted to Facebook in particular. And I had to wean myself off from actually some of the lessons from what you shared on about like replacing the icon. I tried to replace it with different news feeds instead. So every time I was feeling the urge to go to that one particular app on my phone. I tried to provide a substitute. I was trying to identify the triggers in my own being that led me to that, and just tried to be aware of it and call it out, and to be able to switch. I haven't touched social media in 2 years now, and what you were just highlighting there, I felt the mental shift for me personally in such a deep way, and it was also while we were making this film. So I felt this mental freedom and space that just opened up in my brain around like, oh, now I can put that, however many hours we're going a day into scrolling through a feed, now went into creative thinking for the movie. So it had this like additional feedback process around like being constructive in a really positive way. I don't miss it at all. Like I don't miss what I was getting through those platforms. But it has been a really interesting personal journey for me as well.
So, sorry.
I was just going to say, I know that Anna has some really great analogies, but I'm really curious, Andre, your experience working in film and what it is like for you to help tell the story that you know so well that the audience or the director asking questions might not.
Well, I think Anna really said it pretty clearly, and that is the key is to find the core idea. And as a scientist, I'm a lab scientist. I'm in my lab. We look, you'll see lots of, minutia, tools that are focused on millimeter scale, or micrometer scale things, looking at cells, microscopes, chemicals, and so on. But fundamentally, we're doing those actions to try to get knowledge. And that is really the product of my laboratory, knowledge. And when the knowledge is good and mature, we can talk about it in terms of concepts. And so that's fundamentally whenever I've worked with people whose job is on the other side, the communication end of this, what you do. I do my very best to inhibit myself and getting excited about all the details, which I love. I feel very comfortable in that world. I can even show off in that world, but the job is to actually show the knowledge, what we know. And I think Anna said it really very well. When you're sure or very confident about that, then it really doesn't matter exactly how you communicate it. What's important is that you communicate the knowledge accurately. But whether I show you a picture of a cell or some dopamine, or instead I just show someone repeatedly doing something in a mindless way, but that's very stereotyped, the idea is ultimately the same. And whatever I think works for the audience to whom you're trying to communicate with, it would be different if it's a young adult group, whether it's a group of 10-year-olds, whether it's a bunch of aged researchers. How you do that should be different. It's different when depending on what class we happen to teach, what level of education they have, what their prerequisites are, etc. So I think that really is the focus. What is the idea? And I try and challenge the storytellers to not worry about the details. I always say, we can invent the way to get there. That's like easy for me as a scientist. The hard part is like owning that this is the idea that we're trying to grapple with and communicate. And once we commit to that, the rest isn't trivial, but I think it's easier than it might seem.
So Jeff and Larissa, I have a question for you. So it seems like, from our perspective at least, most films that tell a science story tend to be nonfiction. And many of those films also bring in sort of either animation or some other device to help visually tell that story. Do you think that there is a bigger role for science in nonfiction? And do you see that changing, especially not necessarily long form storytelling, but shorter form storytelling too?
Just to clarify your question there, Judy, in for science or
Oh, I think he's asking, did you mean narrative films? That there's a bigger role for it to play in narrative films, in fiction films, as opposed to
nonfiction? Yeah.
Yeah, fiction. I mean, because, we talk about science and storytelling as the overarching structure of the Film and Science Initiative. But most people think of science films as documentary style films.
Right.
Yeah.
Larissa, I can hit that unless you want to.
Go for it. Yeah, no.
There are a number of science communities. There are a number of film communities that try to bring together screenwriters and scientists to try to bring more and more accurate science into fictional and narrative storytelling. And that's been something that I've been very, very impressed to see in the few places that I've seen it, trying to provide climatologists to different films. There have been a handful of fictional movies that have so over-embellished the impacts of climate change that it has made some people dismiss climate change because, oh, Hollywood's just, turning it into a parody in some ways. So I think there's been an intent among some communities to really try to bring more and more accurate science into the overall stories that are being told. I think that's amazing. I think that's beautiful and necessary. From my perspective and the work that we do, our team at Exposure Labs, we feel very, very strongly about our responsibility to be accurate in the ideas that we are disseminating to the world. We've had ideas for narrative fictional stories that are rooted heavily in science or have a grounding and a basis in science. And I think that's been an exciting pursuit for us to be able to bring those concepts to life, but with authenticity. Just one more thing to add for all of our projects that we've done. This isn't a formal process, but we've effectively peer reviewed our movies. Like with every film that we've created, we've had additional scientists come in and review and fact check. And so, Anna, your comments were fact checked by other people as well, just making sure that hoping that you're happy with it, but wanting to make sure that it passes muster with others as well.
That's very good. I didn't know you did that.
And we've made countless changes. And there are times where it's so painful too, because it's like that line was so good, but it's inaccurate and we're going to have to change it because...
Not your lines, Anna. Your lines are good.
But that's something that we, not only in having others peer review, but then our own internal team doing very thorough fact checking of the entire film, which is painstaking for our team to go through and review. I feel that, as of now, as we're releasing the film, the best science and the best research that we've been able to find supports the points that we're making and the arguments brought up. And certainly there are opinions in the film that we can debate, but the factual accuracy we feel strongly about. Just as another example there are other films that have come out and then they get ripped apart around this was inaccurate, that was inaccurate, and therefore the whole film is moot. And we've, knock on wood, we've not had that criticism on our work, in large part because we've been just so diligent about the fact checking.
I have to take a moment to shout out Daniel, Stacy, and Sarah, who are the incredible team that helped us fact check some 800 lines of dialogue and different interviews. And it really is a process for us, and we take it really seriously because we know how seriously the scientists and our subjects take their work. So I think it's a good point to bring up that we want to make sure that we're presenting the science in the way that it is intended. Not only so that people can digest it, but that it's accurate. And as we learn from it, people are walking away with that idea. And I think, Judy, to your point about how science can be used in film, I look at the film The Martian as an incredible example. If you haven't read the book, I encourage you to do it because it's just the most fascinating read where you suddenly all understand the physics of how gravity and other things are so critical to our life form. But they did such a wonderful job, I think, in translating that to the screen. And there was so much science in it, but it was exciting. And I think that's one of the misconceptions about science that I have learned in this journey as a filmmaker. You sometimes get this idea in your head of there's a lab and a white coat and it's, boring facts. And that is so not how it is. And meeting Anna and Andre and all of the other scientists we've had the privilege to to work with, you get the most wonderful like world opened up to you in terms of what they see, and just their passion for it is just something that kind of is ephemeral in normal circumstances, but becomes tangible in the way that they're able to describe their work. So I think the balance of art and science is such a fine balance, but it's just, without the science, we wouldn't be able to tell the stories we tell.
Thank you. So I'm just going to say, hold on one sec. We have about 7 more minutes for the audience out there. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll try and get to them.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. You know, when we talk about science, we collect a huge number of facts, but the people who do science, they're humans, and they use their minds, just like all humans do, to interpret those things that we can measure. So what is really, you know, interesting, if you go and join a lab discussion, you'll see that we will read what's been published, peer-reviewed, fact-checked as much as possible, and we'll all agree on what was measured, but we almost never agree on what we learned from those measurements. You know, my lab will always have its own version of how to interpret those facts. You know, one of the beautiful examples, there's a very famous, you can almost think of him as the father of neuroscience, Ramon Cajal. He looked in a microscope, in fact, in a lousy microscope, at tissue samples from brain. And he had this amazing ability to draw what he saw. And so he drew what he saw in the microscope. But very interesting, two facts. He looked for hours, and then he stepped away from the microscope and drew from memory. Okay? Why that was important is because he didn't draw what he saw. He drew what he understood. And if you look at his diagrams, there have been art exhibits because they're so beautiful, but he adds things like arrows. There are no arrows in those images, but the arrow shows a concept of what a brain does, generating signals that go in a particular way. Now, this is 100-ish years before we actually knew that, but he looked at the tissue, used his imagination, used the concepts that he had developed and won a Nobel Prize for, okay, by doing what all scientists do. We collect the facts, we think about them, we try to fit them to a model that we have of how the universe works, or at least that small piece of the universe that we're focused on in our research. And that's really not that crazy different from what those algorithms are doing, if you want to get meta. Those algorithms are taking a lot of data, are trying to fit the data to some model of what you are and what your next action will be and what will keep you there. And in doing so, may or may not be very successful, but the reason it resonates with us and the reason stories resonate with us is because that's what we fundamentally do. Science is really storytelling. It's storytelling with certain constraints, but you know, we're not making it up, but in some sense, just like Cajal did, he made up those arrows. They happen to be correct arrows and informative. And you know, 30, 40, 50 years later, when people developed the technologies to make the electrical measurements, they could see that his concepts were actually correct. But that's the process. So we're really not that far off from what it is that we're trying to do. It just might look different.
That's brilliant. So
That's awesome.
one last round of conversation. Why do you think science is under such attack today, or has you know, we've come to a divide, people who believe in it and people who don't believe in it? How do you think a film can sort of bridge that divide? Or do you think you're going to be sort of still playing to an audience that has a certain belief structure? Yeah.
Really great question.
Great question.
Just fix everything, basically.
Yeah, unless anybody has a strong opinion on this. I think, well, I don't know, I always look at the cigarette industry as a great example of where there was an intentional campaign against science for financial interests. And a playbook was written in that process that has been continued into the fossil fuel industry, replicating a lot of those same tactics, often called a FUD campaign, FUD, for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And if you can question the science or delay or dismiss or deny, it allowed for, in those particular cases, from my opinion, business interests to profit longer. And I think, unfortunately, that's kind of given a playbook around denying science when the science doesn't align with one's, in some cases, political views or what have you. I think there's a huge, huge challenge. I don't have, it's also one of the facts that we present in The Social Dilemma is that on social media, particularly on Twitter, lies spread 6 times faster than the truth. And when you have an information ecosystem where falsehoods can go spread like wildfire while the truth is chugging along, it's really hard to align the public with facts and truth in that scenario. So I think there's a huge, huge uphill battle for the science community, for the news community, for journalists. How do we shift back to a culture and a world where facts actually do matter? And a shared truth is the basis from which we can make our decisions. I wish we had answers to that.
I guess though, I agree with you, but I think that science, the way that it's perceived and often communicated, can fail to answer some deeper philosophical yearnings that people have. And I think it can answer those questions, but we're not communicating it in the right way. I actually thought Andre's wonderful description of the role of imagination, and I would even use the word intuition, in science is not fully appreciated. And if we could communicate that better, people could be inspired and moved and transformed by science in the way that they are by, for example, religion. So I think the problem is that we've polarized, like so much else, we've polarized these dimensions. And I mean, I actually think science is a religion, and for good and bad. And so, but I think it's on science to recognize that it's somehow often impoverished. And how can we enrich science in a way that people don't just learn the facts, but also feel inspired and moved? And I think, your work does that. So, that's wonderful.
Yeah, just to
give you the last word, Andre. We're going to need to go. Sorry.
Okay, I was just very short, quick point. Part of the challenge is I feel fortunate as a scientist because I have bought into this religion, if you will, that's trained me to understand and deal with uncertainty. I have a really, really deep training in how to manage uncertainty. So I look at the world as if it's uncertain, and I know how to operate with that. And we don't do a very good job of training people for that or representing science as just managing the uncertainty. We often talk about things in absolutes when they're really not.
Nice.
Well, I just want to thank everybody, and this conversation has so much to it. We could go on for a much longer time. I really do hope that you will all be able to join us in Woods Hole for a much more extensive meeting, and we can't wait for The Social Dilemma to come out. Jeff and Larissa, I think it's going to be a really important film. I think a lot of people are going to have a lot of opinions about the film too, and I'll be watching it. But everything that we've talked about here really leads us into the panelists who are coming in now for the second half of the Film and Science panel. So thank you, Andre. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Jeff and Larissa. Yeah. We will hopefully have you all back soon.
Thank you all
Thank you
so
so
much.
much, Judy.
Thank you for including me. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.